The alignment mechanic has been present in Dungeons & Dragons since its very first editions. However, it has changed considerably from a wargaming mechanic, the mechanic of faction membership, to a system of something like moral psychology. Unfortunately, the moral psychology of today's version of Dungeons & Dragons is still couched in the original factional language of its first editions, law, chaos, good, and evil. And so there is imprecision, inelegance, and a great deal of confusion. Not surprisingly, the most current edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which is its most successful edition, 5th edition, has mostly done away with the importance of alignment and delegated its tasks to the system of traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws. Now, while I think this is overall an improvement, the alignment mechanic can still be useful both to dungeon masters and to players if we just disambiguate a couple of ideas and clarify a couple of notions. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and we're going to talk about alignment today. Let's discuss alignment as a factional system first, before we move on to it as a system of moral psychology. Originally, the system of alignment in Dungeons & Dragons was drawn from the novella by Poul Anderson, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. In it, the protagonist, a man named Holger, who's a soldier in World War II, gets shot and wakes up in a fantasy version of medieval France, in which the world is divided between 2 factions. There is the faction of law, represented by humankind and its representatives, and then there is the faction of chaos, represented mainly by fey creatures such as fairies, trolls, and giants. These factions are represented as being at war with one another, and although there's a great deal of psychological and motivational diversity on either side, whether you were with law or chaos was a factional idea. You were either aligned with chaos, or you were aligned with law. Alignment in this sense was a question of whose side you were on. All of this makes sense, of course, in the context of a war game in which you have 2 factions that are fighting. When a war game is infused with a certain kind of fantasy and magical aesthetic, we can imagine these factions having a cosmic dimension of good versus evil or law versus chaos. Again, we're thinking of whose side you're on, not what psychology you have or what your character traits are, just whose side are you on. So conceived, it makes sense that in the earliest editions of Dungeons & Dragons, when alignment still seemed to be something of a factional notion, that there were such things as, say, an alignment language. An alignment language makes a lot more sense if you're thinking of alignment as a factional notion. If you and I are on the same faction, for instance, we're on the same side of a certain war, it might make sense for us to speak the same language. We would need to communicate as allies, after all. Thinking of alignment as a moral psychological notion, however, that makes no sense, right? Why should you and I share a same language just because we share a moral outlook? That doesn't make sense. Of course, there's a figurative sense in which I could say, you're speaking my language if you say something I agree with, but that's clearly not what's going on here, not mechanically at all. So originally, alignment seems to be something of a factional notion. It's a team notion. That's not how alignment works in 5th edition, but we could imagine it working that way. Let's consider briefly, for fun, the idea of a factional alignment system. This is just a system in which we say that your alignment is your faction. If you are a member of the Emerald Enclave faction, let's say, then that means that your alignment is Emerald Enclave. That's kind of cool. Formally speaking, this means that a character could have multiple alignments. You could be aligned with the Emerald Enclave, for instance, and you could also be aligned with the Harpers. And you might also be aligned with some church and some civic organization and a thieves guild even. Also, a factional alignment system allows for your alignment to be something that you unlock as an achievement. If you have achieved membership in a certain faction, that means that you have achieved a certain kind of alignment. Your alignment now includes the Lord's Alliance. Furthermore, if we construe alignment as a factional notion, it would make sense that there are intelligent but unaligned creatures. An unaligned creature is not some unintelligent thing without a moral psychology. It's just someone that says, whoa, I'm going to sit this one out when they see all of the factions fighting amongst society. And of course, if you have a factional alignment system, that means that alignment will not determine psychology or moral outlook. That allows for there to be anti-heroes and anti-villains, people fighting on various sides of a conflict, but who differ in their moral outlook entirely. That's pretty cool. Now, of course, you don't have to treat alignment as a factional notion in order to have all of these cool things. On the contrary, you can just have a system of factions. And indeed, Wizards of the Coast has released products like Waterdeep Dragon Heist, which details a faction system. And there are lots of very creative and elegant homebrews for factional systems as well. I believe Keith Ammann of The Monsters Know What They're Doing has one available on the DM's Guild, in fact. But it's interesting to note that you can chart a very clear line of historical influence from alignment as it was originally conceived, and factions as they are currently used. The mechanic of alignment in Dungeons & Dragons has a kind of bifurcation in its history. Sometime early on, before even the second edition was out, it became clear that alignment was not so much a purely factional notion as it was also a psychological one. And so, as the camera began to zoom in on one single miniature in a wargame, and as further editions of Dungeons & Dragons became ever more focused on character and character development, alignment ceased to be factional and became more of something like moral psychology. And this is how it is in the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, where law and chaos are said to represent a character's propensity to believe in laws and to believe in order versus to reject those things, and good and evil are measured in terms of a character's altruism or helpfulness or something like that. So, having talked about alignment as a factional notion, let's move on and clarify and critique alignment as a system of moral psychology. As a system of moral psychology, alignment in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, as well as in a couple editions that preceded it, is represented as a kind of 3x3 grid, where on one hand there's an axis that goes up and down, with lawful being at the top, chaotic being at the bottom, and neutral being the middle row. And then there's also a left-right axis, with the left column being good, the middle column being neutral, and the rightmost column being evil aligned. And you've seen many memes and charts and various online content that's probably corresponded to this. As I mentioned before, unfortunately, these terms are not very helpful as a system of moral psychology, and because of this, there's a lot of people talking past each other and a lot of confusion when it comes to implementing these ideas as a game mechanic. Let's start out with the law-chaos distinction. According to the Player's Handbook, the difference between being lawful and being chaotic has to do with your character's belief in whether society should have laws, whether order is a good thing, and whether you should go along with societal customs, structures, and prohibitions. By contrast, a chaotic character is one who rejects society's laws, who rejects hierarchies, who rejects rules, and who doesn't believe in obeying those sorts of things. Now, while that's a very interesting sort of distinction, it doesn't actually become a very actionable or a very interesting distinction when you look at most of the moral dilemmas that characters might face. Here's a dilemma. Do we kill the baby goblins in order to achieve a good consequence, which is that there won't be future goblins to attack our village? Or do we focus on the fact that they are children and that killing them would be a sort of war crime and it's never acceptable to do that no matter what the consequences? That's an interesting moral dilemma. It comes up all the time. Baby monsters are a standard moral dilemma in Dungeons & Dragons. But whether you believe in laws or not does not appear to directly decide the matter. Likewise, here's one that comes up often. Do you torture the captive in order to get information that would lead to better consequences overall? Or are you against torture entirely, and do you think that it doesn't matter the consequences, you just can't torture? That's another dilemma that frequently arises between PCs in a game of Dungeons & Dragons, and whether you believe in laws or not, again, does not directly decide the matter. It's a conflict that can exist between two good-aligned PCs, but law and chaos doesn't seem to cut any ice here, at least not as described in the Player's Handbook. If our moral psychological system in D&D is going to be two axes, one of which is good and evil, then the other axis of alignment should be one along which we can easily measure and express the sorts of conflicts that good aligned PCs would fall into. And the law-chaos axis doesn't do that, as described in the Player's Handbook at least. So what does describe it? Well, here's what I think works a lot better. Instead of talking about whether you believe in laws or whether you believe in chaos, talk about whether a character is principled or whether they are consequentialist. And for the ease of explanation, let's start with chaos first, or the chaotic alignment. A chaotic character, intuitively, if we use examples as our guide, is one which tends to disregard principles, disregard injunctions, disregard prohibitions, and to seek the ends no matter what the means. In other words, a chaotic character is one that seems to think that the ends justify the means. A chaotic character, ethically speaking, is a consequentialist character, a character that measures the value of things in terms of their consequences, and which disregards considerations about which principles you're violating in order to achieve those consequences. If we treat the chaotic alignment as a consequentialist alignment, it then makes sense why the chaotic character would kill the baby monsters in order to achieve the consequence of there being no monsters in the future to fight. It makes sense why the chaotic character would torture the captive in order to achieve the consequence of finding out the crucial information. It makes sense that the chaotic character would only follow laws when convenient, because the following of laws concerns the means, and what they're interested in is the consequences. The player's handbook describes a chaotic alignment as one that disregards laws, but it's inelegant when it comes to adjudicating other moral disputes. If we treat the chaotic alignment as a consequentialist one first and foremost, then we get the result that the player's handbook describes when it comes to laws and contracts and things like that, but we also achieve an underlying explanation which extends to all these other moral dilemmas too. To be chaotic, alignment-wise, is to be consequentialist, ethically speaking. That's what the real alignment should be, is consequentialist. As opposed to principled, or the fancy philosopher's word for principled is deontic. Ethically speaking, what lawful means is deontic, or principled. This is an outlook which says that there are certain principles that you can never ever violate, no matter the consequences. If we indeed treat the chaotic alignment as a consequentialist one, it makes sense to treat the lawful alignment as a deontic one. A lawful character, in this sense, is one that has principles, and those principles can never ever be violated, no matter the consequences. So a lawful character may think that it's wrong in principle to kill a baby creature in combat. And that would explain why, regardless of the consequences, the lawful good character would not kill the baby goblins. Likewise, a lawful character may have a principle against torture, and that would explain why, no matter what the consequences may be, no matter how many people may be saved by implementing this tactic of torture, the lawful character won't do it. And, assuming that a lawful character has some principle concerning the propriety of societal rule, it would make sense that overall lawful characters would heed laws in the societies that they find themselves traveling through. Once again, in the same way that if we describe chaotic alignments as consequentialist ones, we get the results that the player's handbook describes and more, so it is with describing lawful alignments as deontic or principled ones. If a lawful character is a deontic or principled character, ethically speaking, that explains not only why they would tend to obey the law, but also why they would not execute the baby monsters, why they would not torture the captive, and why they would find themselves at odds with a chaotic character, even if both of them are good. So, instead of just saying there's law and chaos, and trying to describe those in vague terms involving a belief in civic structure, let's treat them as ethical categories of whether they have a consequentialist or a principled or deontic moral outlook. That's our tune-up for the law-chaos axis of alignment in 5th edition. But what about the good-evil axis? Does that need some fixing? I think so. Here's the problem with the good-evil axis so far. At least as phrased, it's not very explanatory. Saying that a character is good-aligned or evil-aligned, well, it's factional. It's like saying they're a good guy or a bad guy. It's not that I don't know what good guy means or that I don't know what bad guy means, but when you say of someone that they are a good guy, I don't know what makes them good or what that consists in. I just know that they're a protagonist, that they're on maybe the same side as me, if I'm good. It's not very helpful, it's not very explanatory, especially if what we're trying to do is use alignment as a system of moral psychology, which 5th edition does. Now fortunately, the good-evil axis is a lot easier to explain than the law-chaos axis, whose explanation required a dip into these ethical categories of consequentialism and deontic theory. When it comes to being good or evil, it's easy to understand this in terms of altruism and vicious selfishness. We're saying vicious selfishness because we are excluding any possibility of somebody being selfish by going around and pursuing the warm fuzzy feeling they get from helping people. There is obviously some technical sense in which we might call that selfish, maybe, but that is not what's at work here. A good aligned character is an altruistic character. It's a character that enjoys helping other people, and who does not make an exception for themselves when they promote the general good. A good aligned character is someone who's just always on the lookout to help other people, who likes helping other people, and who is preoccupied with the idea that there's injustice and that there are people in need and those people need help, and you should always be acting on that and thinking of those people. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the evil aligned character is one who is viciously selfish. This is somebody who pursues their own interests at the expense of everyone else's, and those interests do not include some warm fuzzy feeling of seeing other people do well. This is someone who is only interested in their own direct prosperity, even if it's at the expense of other people, and they will try to pursue that. An evil aligned character, in this sense, will always want to make sure that they get the biggest share, that they are spared the danger, that they get the most treasure, that they get the position of leadership, that they are the one who gets ahead, that they are the first on the bus, that they get all the advantages, and that other people just don't deserve the same consideration for one reason or another. Either they're not as good, or it's just everyone for themselves. And of course, in the middle, you've got the neutral character. This, I imagine, is most of us. This is someone who has ethical principles, who cares about other people, who doesn't want to see other people suffer, and who tries to aim at the general good, but who also has some concern for themselves, some special concern. Some concern which says, well, I don't want to be the one who dies, where there's a tension between their principles and their self-preservation, and they might side with the principles on some days and the self-preservation on the other days. But there's no general sense of malice or selfishness in the vicious sense. They're just neutral. So, once we reconstrue these alignment categories in a sense of moral psychology, and we lay them out on a grid, we have an interesting and explanatory system here. On one end of the spectrum, the strong heart, the paladin end of the spectrum, we've got a principled altruist, or deontic altruist. This is someone who sets principles about being altruistic. I must always help the needy. I must never tell a lie. I must never cheat. I must never betray a promise. And because they are principle-based, they are never going to break these principles. They're always going to pursue the good of everyone before themselves, and they're going to do it on the basis of principles. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got the Zarak the Assassin, who is a viciously selfish consequentialist. This is someone who says, the ends always justify the means, and it's always for me, me, me. I need to get mine, and once I've got mine, I don't need to worry about anyone else. This is a character that is willing to break promises, tell lies, backstab, betray, and do all kinds of devious things in order to further their own personal interests. And then moving on back to the altruism end of the spectrum, but on the other side of principled, we've got the Mulliver type, the chaotic good type, the Robin Hood type. This is someone who is an altruistic consequentialist. An altruistic consequentialist wants to help others no matter what principles get violated. This person will break a promise to help other people. This person will torture an innocent to help other people. This person will kill baby monsters in order to help everyone in the long run. There are certain things that are bad in the short term, but if you keep your eyes on the long term, and you're really working for the benefit of all, especially the innocent and the good, that's this alignment, the altruistic consequentialist. The opposite of this, of course, is someone who is principled, but viciously selfish. This is a person who's always pursuing their own self-interests, who doesn't really focus on the interests of other people at all, and who certainly pursues their own self-interests at the expense of the interests of others, but who has a code. They have rules. They might have a rule that says, I leave no survivors. No matter what the benefits might be to me, I leave no survivors. It's simply not something I do. Or, I always get revenge. That's another principle that you could imagine an evil character adhering to, even though there might be consequences in which not getting revenge would work out for them more in terms of what happens. Or what about just, I always obey the demon lord Orcus? That's a perfect example of a viciously selfish yet principled character. And of course, all around the edges you have the rest. The neutral altruist, a person who tries to help others, but who has some principles and sometimes might violate those principles if the circumstances are extreme enough. You've got someone who's neutral but viciously selfish. Again, this person tries to always pursue their own self-interests, and they have some principles, but those things are more like guidelines than absolute rules, and if the circumstances are extreme enough, they might violate those principles. You've got someone who is principled but absolutely neutral. This is someone who has not made it their life quest to help others, but who definitely will abide by a certain moral code, probably a moral code that mostly extends to themselves and their own personal behavior, but it's a moral code that puts themselves on an equal par with others. And then you've got a completely neutral consequentialist. This is someone who doesn't really care about laws or contracts or any kinds of rules, and they try to have a good time and benefit themselves, but they also care a lot about their close loved ones and their family and some other people that they also try to help. Whether they're helping themselves or helping their loved ones, they don't exactly pay attention to laws or rules or promises, but they definitely try to benefit more than just themselves. And the absolute neutral, of course, is someone who has a few principles, but they can be violated, and when it comes to helping others and helping themselves, they're in sort of a balance, and the best way to understand this one is to just arrive at it via abstraction from understanding the others. So this is a way to reconstrue alignment as a system of moral psychology, but in terms that are much more precise than just law, chaos, good, and evil. This is really what those terms mean. I think especially when it comes to the law and chaos axis is much more helpful to construe them in terms of consequentialism and being principled or deontic. Anyway, that's a brief video about two notions of alignment. Alignment as a factional system on one hand, and alignment as a system of moral psychology on the other. What do you think? Do you use both of these notions in your game? Do you think that it makes sense to construe alignment as more of a factional one? Do you have problems thinking about lawful and chaotic psychologies? Did this help you? Or did you find it totally unhelpful? Either way, let me know in the comments. Thanks very much for watching this video. As you can tell, my equipment is ever improving and my videos continue to be uploaded weekly. Please, if you enjoy them, consider subscribing, clicking like, and of course, hit that bell icon if you want to get notified about new content, which I always upload every week. Thanks everyone for watching. See you next time.